a man, who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Coffee is one of the most powerful substances in the known universe. I'll bet that is how those flying saucers are powered. I can just imagine aliens lined up at the Organic Man coffee trike, buying massive amounts of coffee to make their ships go. If you'd like to catch them in the act, try visiting 4501 McPherson and watch for the aliens. They should be about 3.5 feet tall with gray skin. If it's too far or you don't have a flying saucer, you can still get the best coffee in the universe by going to organicmancoffeetrike.shop. I have to thank Carol Ann from the In Between for tonight's show, and I hope I don't screw it up too bad. My wife, being a school teacher, brings home lots of things from work. Lots of things. She gets presents and gift cards and cakes and cookies and illnesses. She catches nasty colds from her kids and then brings them home to me. I like the gift cards, especially from Chick-fil-A, and the cakes and the cookies are great. Those viruses, they can be a whole lot annoying. As I'm working on my notes, I'm feeling a whole lot under the weather. My head was hurting and I felt a bit dizzy. I would go back and I'd read my notes and I'd wonder, what the heck did I just write? As I'm recording the show, I'm still not all the way back to normal. It sounds like my head is packed full of cotton when I speak. Hopefully, I don't sound as weird coming over the microphone as I do inside my own head. If you've followed the show for a few years and you've gone back and binged some of the old shows, you might know that even when I feel sick, I still tend to do the show. Never let a little thing like not being able to breathe stop you. Don't worry, as far as I know, you can't pass a virus over the sound waves. At least, not that I know of. I made a lot of mistakes while writing. Thank God for spell check. I just misspelled a spell check. The show must go on, but at what cost? Hopefully, I'll get through it without making any bizarre noises on the mic. I used to have a cough button on my old rig, the the one that I started out with, and whenever I felt the urge to cough, all I had to do is I'd push this button. It would stop the microphone for a second or two. You could cough, clear your throat, continue recording, and as far as the audience knew, it was nothing, just you making some weird facial gestures. With my new rig, where the microphone plugs straight into the computer, I had to buy a new cough button. Well, apparently, the people that designed that cough button don't know what the thing is supposed to do. When I would push it, it would shut everything off, and I do mean everything. I would have to reboot the computer. So much for that. So now I just turn my head and I try not to cough for too long. Mount Vottovaara is a popular attraction in Russia. The mountain is situated in the remote forest of the Karalia. Karalia, I believe that's how it's pronounced. It's 100 miles west of Medvedhegorsk, and it is surrounded in mysteries. The mountain has a collection of prehistoric stone monuments called seds, which means hanging or flying stones. It features hundreds of small and huge boulders combined to create an intricate network of geometric patterns and labyrinths. The facility is far more extensive than all the combined public worship spaces in Scandinavia and Europe. A curious investigator has discovered things in the furthest reaches of the Karelian taiga, also known as the boreal forest, that do not conform to the framework of rational concepts of what the ancient man was capable of doing, including these monuments that are situated atop the mountain. The closest village is about 20 miles from the summit of the West Karelian Highlands, which rises almost 1,400 feet above sea level. An earthquake approximately 9,000 years ago resulted in a gigantic fault, forming a natural amphitheater with little lakes and cliffs in the middle. Some scientists speculated many years ago locals came to this location to perform religious ceremonies. The boulders sitting atop those stones were used to represent some unknown deities or entities. There was no written language back then. One name for the stones is the Vottovaara Sejdui, which is a cult boulder or a piece of rock with clear evidence of human impact and artificial selection from the surroundings. The ridge's highest point and the amphitheater's slopes are home to the densest population of these stone seds. Indeed. I found one website where the writer tried to convince folks the huge boulders sitting on these tiny rocks were put there as the ice sheet retracted. I'm not very surprised somebody would say this. The boys in the white lab coat will say any kind of trash in an attempt to make any mysteries go away. Weather balloons, swamp gas, ice sheets. I think they all get their ideas from the same game book. Just say something. A lot of people will believe it. Yes, it's going to be one of those kind of shows. Wow. It gets sparkly when I do that. Some of y'all will understand that. What does surprise me is how many people read this nonsense and then believe it. See, the guy that wrote this is a scientist. He has a white lab coat and everything. There are letters after his name. He got a grant to say that, to look into this. What was it Stanton Friedman called it? Investigation by decree? Most stones are found in clusters of 2 to 6 pieces. The structure's legs are supported by multiple smaller stones and topped by massive boulders that can weigh up to 3 tons. The rest of the stones are found resting on cliffs and banks of an old river. Superstitious folk at one time considered this place to be the focus of evil forces and the bridge to the other world. One reason is the anomalous phenomenon that has been observed in this place. The trees on top of this mountain are ugly, bent, and gnarled. Believe it or not, they make those trees in Romania look attractive. The lakes are all dead. Due to its dire condition, it has earned the nickname Death Mountain. There are moss covered stone terraces on the mountainside. The spruce and pine, with remnants of past forest fires and ancient logging scattered throughout. The ancient pine trees are about 122 years old, but they only stand from 6 to, I'm not going to say 7, 6 to 8 feet tall. Furthermore, something strange appears to be causing the local birch trees to rotate. As they grow, they turn in a circle, making the bark look really weird. According to the locals, Death Mountain is the bridge to the other world and the center of evil energies. As such, it has become a popular destination for pilgrimages. One of the most famous stories associated with Vottovaara is the tale of the stone pillars. According to local legend, these pillars were created by the gods as a form of protection. But for us or them? It is said that the stones were once part of a massive structure built by ancient Karelian people to communicate with the spirits. The pillars are believed to be imbued with magical powers, and some visitors claim to feel a sense of energy or heightened awareness when they are near these rocks. I'm back. Did you miss me? Vottovaara's significance in Karelian folklore is not limited to its role as a sacred site. Many stories have been passed down through generations, each one adding to the mountain's mystique. One such story tells of a legendary creature that roams the forests, a massive bear that guards the mountain and ensures that only those worthy of its secrets may enter. And I imagine most of us would say, we're not worthy. This creature, according to legend, is a symbol of the mountain's untamed nature and its ability to protect those who show respect for the land. Joe the Georgian, aka Joseph Stalin, was a nasty piece of work. He murdered his own cousin after he'd been romantically involved with her for years. It was probably to keep her mouth shut. He probably killed Lenin, as far as most people are concerned. He was the only one in the room when the former Soviet leader passed away. Probably burked him. If you don't know what burking is, well, I was going to say go back and listen to some of my past shows, but I'll tell you. Burke and Hare, better known as the Scottish Resurrectionists, got tired of having to dig up bodies to sell back in the day. So instead, they decided to make their own dead bodies. They would put a pillow over a person's face and hold it down until they stopped struggling. Therefore, when you suffocate somebody with a pillow, it is called burking. And now you know. Where was I? Oh, yes. Joe the Georgian probably burked Lenin. When Hitler invaded Poland under a false flag operation, Joe took note. Well, he looked at and got his generals to take note of what was going on. Most of these generals had previously been of much lower ranks. In the lead up to World War II, Joe the Georgian killed most of his generals and colonels. He had done this because he was afraid they were going to do to him what he had been doing to everyone else. Well, as Hitler's invading Poland, Stalin set his sights on Finland instead. Stalin had gutted his army in the bloody 1930s purges, turning the once formidable military machine into a bunch of sheep that walked around baying and saying, "Whatever you want us to do there, Uncle Joe." Okay, they didn't call him Uncle Joe, they called him Boss. "Whatever you want us to do, boss, you say the word and we'll make it happen." Just like a bunch of really good little sheeple. Despite the harshness of the Soviet winters, Russian troops were not trained or equipped to fight in the cold and snow. Soviet field kitchens would simply pump out huge clouds of black smoke that went straight up into the air, giving the Finnish soldiers an idea on where the Soviet troops were. You could tell where their camp was because of that big black pillar of smoke. Kind of a reverse of what the Israelites did in the desert. The Finns used a special screening material to keep the black soot from going up into the air, and they would pipe it out into several different directions so that when the Soviets would see the smoke, they wouldn't see it. When Joe the Georgian gets here, we will dance. Yes, that's a song by Al Stewart, called, of all things, Joe the Georgian. It's a really good song. It's right up there with Laughing into 1939 for the music lovers out there. Joe wanted in on the action, so he told the world that the Finns had attacked a town in Russia named Mayanilla. Kind of the same game plan with Hitler when he attacked that radio station. 450,000 Soviet troops began to march and drive towards the Finn border. Russia had tanks and armored vehicles and bombers and fighters and an almost endless supply of men. The Finns had a total of about 3 million people. That included women, children, old folks, people that were not able to fight, people that were way too old, things like that. But 3 million total people. I imagine some of these women were probably more capable of fighting than most men, living up in such harsh conditions. The Soviets expected the Finns to either line up across the battlefield and die like good little victims, or surrender. They weren't expecting the they weren't expecting the Finnish resilience. Russia issued their soldiers winter gear which came in one basic color, brown. Finland issued their soldiers with white overcoats and white cloth to camouflage their gear. As the Soviets moved west, they made a lot of noise. Have you ever been around a bunch of tanks going down the road? You can hear them miles away. The Finns, on the other hand, they relied on skis to move about. And they did something called guerrilla tactics, which, as far as I know, guerrillas don't use. Enter the White Death. Simo Häyhä, a Finnish soldier, killed around 500 Soviet soldiers in 1 year's time. I did a show about him back in April 2022. His record still stands today. Even after getting shot in the face, he was still a force to be reckoned with. Skiing was Finland's national pastime, and Soviets, well, they didn't ski. Charlie doesn't surf, the Russians don't ski. As a result, Finnish ski troops were trained to stand upright and fire their rifles while skiing. Finnish troops were trained to fire their rifles laying prone on the ground, using their skis to support them. They were not slowed by the weather, but they used it to their advantage. The Soviets, on the other hand, were finding moving about in the snow nearly impossible because they'd never trained for it and they weren't supplied for it. The Finns also had another edge. Their supreme commander, Baron Carl Gustav Mannerheim, who was 72 years old at the time. He had been a Tsarist Russian Guard officer at one time, and he had been the leader during the Finnish Civil War. He was a big game hunter and a humanitarian. He insisted that Finland was not going to negotiate with those Ruskies. Not when the Finnish government, being a bunch of politicians like all of them, decided that they were going to negotiate with the Russians, Mannerheim said, okay, here's my resignation. I'm out of here. As soon as the fighting continued, since the Russians were not about to negotiate, the Finnish government went and begged Mannerheim to please come back and fight this war because, well, I have yet to meet very many politicians that know which end of a gun the bullets come out of. The Soviet attack came on a wide front. November 29th, 1939, the Russians tried to capture a major road junction inside Finnish territory. Finland is a highly forested country, and tanks have to have roads to move about. They are not good in forests, especially old growth forests. Tanks, when they get stuck behind trees and mud and snow and things, just become a giant iron landmark. The saying goes, it is better to be an army of sheep being led by a lion than an army of lions being led by sheep. The field commander, not the commander in chief, this was another guy, he was hiding out 30 miles from the front line with highly sketchy radio equipment, wondering why they were losing that particular battle. Gee, you ever heard of the term lead from the front? As I was researching this show, I got all caught up in the story of the Winter War, and I kind of lost sight on what I was supposed to be talking about the strange things going on. If you'd like to read up about it, and if you're really big into history, check out the Winter War. It will fascinate you. It's long for a 1 year war, but it's well worth reading. Finnish engineers blew a dam at Lake Sorjarvis, which flooded ice cold water into this area, which pretty much slowed down the Russians. But unfortunately, because it was so cold, the water simply froze, and this helped the Russians advance. As the Soviets kept coming, the Finns used everything they had to slow them down. When you have limited numbers of troops and equipment, you don't just throw them away hoping this is going to work. The Soviets ran under the pretense that every person in Russia was a soldier and therefore they had a near endless supply of cannon fodder. You know that old thing about sending them into war? They would have four guys with bullets, but only one rifle. So when the guy in the front of the pack fell over dead, the next guy would pick up the rifle and use it until he'd fell over dead, and then that's how they did it. Cannon fodder. The Soviets kept advancing while the Finns just kept trying new and devious ways to slow them down. Mostly, like I said, guerrilla tactics. You'd hide, you'd wait for the Russians to roll up, you'd shoot a couple of dozen soldiers, and then you'd pack up and slip out the back door real quick while all the Russians spent the next hour crawling on their hands and knees expecting more shooting. And they would do this over and over. The Russian army was losing way too many men for the likes of those in charge. They weren't nearly as concerned by the numbers lost as what Joe was going to think once he found out. What they needed was a way of spotting the Finnish army from, oh, I don't know, a mountaintop maybe? Finland is relatively flat, and the highest place with a commanding view was Mount Vottovaara, which was actually inside Russian territory. Seeing as none of the officers were familiar with the area, they turned to the locals for advice on how to get to the top of the mountain. The locals told them this was a bad idea. The mountain was sacred. You only went there to offer gifts to the beings living up there, and you absolutely had to show respect for the land. The Soviets looked at these locals as a bunch of dim-witted, uneducated, superstitious peasants. And boy, were they wrong. Orders went out to send about 100 men or so up to the top of the mountain. Nobody knows exactly what the number was, just it was about 100 men. An LPOP, listening post, observation post, to look for the Finnish army. They were equipped with the usual arms and the best radios the Soviets had. Word got over to the Finns about the Soviet plans. The Finns sent a small team to the base of the mountain to keep an eye on the Russians, who were there to keep an eye on the Finns. The Russian detachment arrived on top and they set about making it home. Tents were set up and observation posts were dug, and everybody looking to the west to see if they could spot those white clad Finnish soldiers against a white background. Firewood was chopped and laid in for a long nights ahead. Everybody had a job to do. You were either guarding the perimeter, you were watching for the Finnish army, or you were maintaining the camp. The radio operator sent word to their base saying they were set up and they were ready to roll, except the top of the mountain was obscured by fog. They couldn't see past the edge of the top, and since the Finns didn't have any vehicles, there was nothing to listen for. As the night wore on, the air took on a bizarre quality. It began to feel thick, they said, as if it was no longer just air. It became hard to breathe, and this can lead to a lot of agitation. Troops began reporting an unearthly humming sound that seemed to be coming from all directions at once, and yet nowhere at the same time. Nobody could say what was causing this sound. At the bottom of the mountain, the Finns began to hear shots being fired. Lots of shots, along with what sounded like hand grenades being thrown. Men's voices could be heard yelling orders, and then there would be confusion as counter orders were being yelled. Screams from some of the Soviet troops could be heard as well. It sounded as if a major firefight was going on. All the Finnish troops could do was wait and listen, wondering who was attacking their enemies. The firing was not concentrated on one side, but it seemed to be going on in all directions. The Finns had radio equipment and they understood Russian. Finland has a huge population that over the years was part Russian, part Finland, and part Sweden, and part other parts, depending on which year it was. The voices and the Morse code signals were coming from the mountain were saying things about shadow beings moving through the trees faster than any humans could possibly do. There was no order to the fight, and nobody knew who or what was attacking. Only things were getting in very bad shape very quickly. Firing stopped and it got quiet. Too quiet. The Finns could only sit and wait, trying to figure out what was going on upstairs. By morning, the Soviets had managed to regain control of their men, and they took account of what had happened. Lots of bullets had been fired. Lots of unknown enemy had been seen, but never hit. There were no footprints anywhere outside of the camp, except one set. It was obvious a Russian soldier because the boot prints led away from the detachment's camp. The Finns follow correction. The Soviets followed these prints only to come to the end. Footprint, 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 nothing. I've seen people do this while working sign cutting. We're following a set of prints and then suddenly they stop. If you look closely, you can tell that the person making the footprints has now begun walking backwards, stepping squarely into his own footprints. Well, you can only do this for so long before you're going to screw up. There are ways to tell if that's what the person is doing. I'm not going to tell you how, just trust me, good sign cutters can tell. You can only do this for a couple of feet before you're going to give yourself away. Well, the Finns were outdoorsmen. That's what they did to eat. They followed footprints of deer and other things, but whatever they were going to eat. They also had been trained on how to track humans for just in case. All that day, the Soviet troops were agitated. It's hard to get any rest when every sound might be this unknown attacker coming back. As the sun was setting on night number 2, the same weird things began once more. The air grew thick and hard to breathe, and then there was that humming sound. Soon the shadows began to move about, followed by another firefight. More conflicting orders were heard being screamed back and forth on top of the mountain. Stand your ground. Retreat. Stop shooting. This time the radio transmissions grew few and far between, followed by silence. Curiosity can be a good thing. I wonder how ham and pineapple will taste on a pizza. Or curiosity can be a bad thing. Wonder what would happen if I were to mix ammonia with bleach. Don't do it. You're going to create a chemical weapon that will probably kill you. The Finns were curious as to what had happened on top of the mountain. And were there still any Soviets up there? Only one way to find out. Go look. A small team was sent up the side of the mountain. Avoid any contact with the enemy and report back as soon as possible. As they moved through the snow, the Finns would stop and they'd listen for human sounds. In the morning, people are going to be waking up. They're going to be trying to get up and get dressed and get ready for whatever's coming. You're going to hear the sound of food items. Plates and utensils in the military are made out of metal. And so you hear a metal spoon scraping on a metal plate. None of that was coming to the Finnish soldiers. Not a sound was heard, not even a mouse. Something like that. Finally, the Finns were right on the very edge of the Soviet camp. All they could see was destruction. Russian soldiers were everywhere, but they were dead. The Finns looked close and they could see very few of them had bullet wounds. Most had what looked like claw marks. There were a few that did have bullet holes, but it looked more like friendly fire, which isn't. Some soldiers looked like they'd been bitten by something with enormous teeth and a huge mouth. A few bodies had been torn to pieces. Looking around the camp, the Finns found a few bodies that were completely intact. They appeared to have died from fright. The ground was carpeted with spent casings. It looked like the Russians were fighting for, well, their lives. More questions were found than answers. The men kept searching for clues. They found several Russian soldiers who had actually taken their own lives rather than face whatever it was that was attacking. The searchers began to notice the footprints all over the camp were only those of the Russians. No animal prints were found. The team walked the perimeter looking for how the attackers came and went, but the snow showed only prints from those in the camp. No superior force had snuck up in the middle of the night. It was, without a doubt, something very powerful, very angry had descended on the camp, but who or what, nobody was willing to say. The Soviets were wondering what had become of their LPOP as well. All that nonsense about shadows and humming sounds had gotten on the commander's nerves, but now the radio was silent. He dispatched a Soviet team to find out what was going on. The Soviets found the same things the Finn had. More questions, no answers. The Soviet commander initiated a clampdown on all the troops. No one was to speak a word about what happened on that mountain. The LPOP, the missing and dead men, it was all passed off as a strategic battle between the heroic Russians who died gloriously and those nasty Finns who probably used some form of deception to win the day. The officers who died on the mountain were awarded medals posthumously for their bravery and courage under fire. Word was passed around. Leave that mountain alone. It was classified as a no-go zone with no explanation as to why. Soviet soldiers knew one thing for sure. The boss, Joe, didn't like hearing about failures. He was one to punish the messenger as well as the guy in charge. What Joe doesn't know hopefully can't hurt us. The Soviets eventually took control of the Carolinian region, and this is what Joe wanted. A treaty, a piece of paper with ink on it, was signed saying that Russia and Finland were no longer at war. Most treaties don't last as long as it takes the ink to dry. The Soviets bombed a city in Finland, and Finland began the second go at the Russians, called the War of Continuation. War leads to some bizarre alliances. As soon as Russia began marching west, Britain sent some soldiers to help out in defending Finland. 1941, when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa and invaded Russia, surprisingly, the Germans were greeted as a liberating force up until the Nazis began killing anybody that they didn't like. Do not get too confused. German troops were soldiers and Nazis were animals. With Germany now at war with Russia, Finland found themselves with a new, if not altogether nice, ally. The Finnish army was allied with Germany, which placed those British soldiers in a big jam, seeing as Germany was already at war with Britain. I searched as much as I felt necessary, but I could find no account of how the British managed to get home. I would think, seeing as most of the Finns weren't all that crazy about the Nazis telling them who to like or dislike, the locals probably did what they could to get these men out of the country. Today, Mount Vottovaara is a tourist attraction for those who enjoy frostbite. The people going there are warned, do not disrespect the mountain and be wary of unknown encounters. The folks who do go there have reported hearing that same weird humming sound at night in the bitter cold. The folks who do go have a lot more stamina than I have. I do not like cold weather. It makes everything hurt. I spent a few years in Wisconsin due to my dad being a bricklayer, and well, we went where the work was. To thaw out, every year we would drive back to Texas, to our home, usually right before the worst weather set in. I went to Fort Knox in the wintertime. I was at NTC, Fort Irwin, in the wintertime. I went to Fort McClellan in the wintertime. Not going to talk about that cold weather training in Idaho. That was just ridiculous. I am going to pass on ever taking an investigation to Finland. Just too cold. It's not my cup of tea. I like it warm. And people who do go also have found some interesting things. There's an oblong pit, they call it the well, that looks very much man made. The sides are perfectly smooth, and the corners are all at 45-degree angles. Correction, 90-degree angles. Like I said, not feeling good when I was writing up my notes. Not feeling good right now. Over time, the well has had some erosion and some of the rocks have cracked, but if you look at it, you're going to think this is a man made object. Nobody knows how deep the well is. The pit is always filled with water, and nobody has ever bothered to bring any measuring device that they could lower to the bottom. The size and the design of the well is very similar to what has been found at other sacred sites all over the planet. On top of the mountain are those huge round spheres of stone, nearly perfectly round, many that sit atop these skinny little platforms. The round stones are scattered about with no understood pattern. They do resemble spheres that are found in other parts of the world. There's a huge set of stone stairs leading to nowhere. Had there been a structure of some type atop the stairs, there's no evidence of it today. The boys in the white lab coats, of course, those guys, say that this is a normal rock formation that was carved by the glaciers. Yeah, all those 90-degree angles. That's just, nature does that all the time. Like those naturally formed stone stairs found in, well, somewhere other, that one place that they don't like to talk about. The bizarre and unexplained thing about the mountain are the SED stones. SEDs, or SEID stones, are generalized term referring to megaliths of different construction and appearance that are often found in precarious positions. For instance, a SED might be a large boulder perched on smaller stones as if standing on legs, looking a bit like a big stone pig. Another common form is a stone pyramid known as a guri. Some SEDs weigh tens of tons. The boulders on top are so big that had anybody tried moving the stones, they would have crushed the smaller stones used as legs. Some of these SEDs are by themselves, while others are together in clusters, like some form of a maze or a complex. Add to this, some are found in places that it would be dangerous, if not outright impossible, to build. Set atop a cliff face or on a slope that is so steep that you can't walk up the side. Just moving the stones would have been a huge undertaking. Doing it on a cliff face or on a slope, it would have been downright impossible. Nobody knows why these things were built, but they do. They're not telling anyone. For me, a podcast should be an hour long. Not the ones I listen to, the ones I do. Like my book. Any book that I write has to be about 200 pages. My first podcast ran about an hour, and my last podcast ran about an hour. It's just one of those things. One time when Jeff Stewart was on, May 2017, we did the show live back then. I dialed his number, and his answering machine picked up, and then nothing. It went dead. For the next 14 minutes, it's nothing but me trying to fill dead air space by yammering and punching in his number on Skype, trying to get a hold of Jeff. Since I don't edit the show, if you go back and you listen to that interview, you can speed fast through the first 14 minutes. You won't miss anything. When Jeff finally did come on, I was able to talk to him for about 45 minutes. Recorded the show, which did come to an hour long. Well, the show was actually only 45 minutes because of all that me typing numbers and the thing hanging up on me. If I'm getting close to the hour mark as I'm doing a show and I notice I've still got a couple pages of notes, I'll either try and talk really fast or I'll just say, well, that's the end of the show. Well, that's the way it was. No, I'll just simply end the show at about an hour. I have run over a few times. That's just because I don't pay attention to what the clock says. In my unexplained need to make every show as close to an hour as possible, I am going to round out today with a weird story of man versus nature. It went from being a nuisance to war being declared. The winners of the conflict are not what anyone would have predicted. Following World War I, large numbers of veterans who had served in the war were given land by the Australian government to take up farming within Western Australia, often in agriculturally marginal areas, aka crappy land that nobody else wanted. They couldn't pay their soldiers, and so they just gave them a bunch of scrub land. With the onset of the Great Depression, 1929, these farmers were encouraged to increase their wheat crops, with the government promising that they were going to subsidize the crops, which of course they never did. When will people learn? Governments cannot tell the truth. It goes against their nature. If a politician isn't lying, I think their heart stops or something. It's one of those weird things. Because of the recommendations and the promised subsidies, wheat prices began to fall. Well, what do you expect? You've got too much of an item. Hmm. I could I could have told them that, but nobody ever asks me anything. Well, at least not back in the 20s or 30s. Maybe because I wasn't here yet. Well, getting back to the story. Because of all this extra wheat growing, well, the farmers were getting really upset. The difficulties went from bad to worse with the arrival of about 20,000 emus. Those giant flightless birds would migrate after the breeding season, heading to the coast. With the cleared land and the additional water supplies being made available for livestock by the Western Australian farmers, the emus found that this cultivated land was a good place to hang out, and they began to forage into the farm territory. In particular, these marginal farms that were barely making headway, and now they're being attacked by these birds. The emus consumed or they destroyed crops, and they left huge gaps in the rabbit fence. If you don't know about the rabbit fence, I suggest you look it up. It's what happens when man messes with Mother Nature. Farmers relayed their concerns about the birds ravishing their crops, and a deputation of ex soldiers were sent to meet with the Minister of Defense, Sir George Percy. Having served in World War I, the soldier settlers were well aware of the effectiveness of machine guns, and they requested their deployment. The minister readily agreed, although with conditions attached. The guns were to be used by military personnel. Troop transport was to be financed by the Western Australian government, and the farmers would provide food, accommodations, and they had to pay for the ammo. This is kind of like allowing foreigners to enter your country illegally and then forcing us to pay their upkeep. Wait, didn't that just happen? Pierce also supported the deployment on the grounds that these birds would make for some very good target practice. Live pop up targets. That's what they thought. So the army was sent out to do battle with a bunch of flightless birds. Defense Minister Sir George Percy ordered the army to cull the emu population. He later became known as the Minister of the Emu War. Military involvement was due to begin October 1932. The war was conducted under the command of Major Gwynedd Purvis Wayne Aubrey Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery, 7th Heavy Artillery. This is just way too many names for anybody to be allowed to use. Meredith commanding soldiers. He had two soldiers under him, Sergeants McMurray and O'Halloran, who were armed with a couple of Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The Lewis gun, or the Lewis automatic rifle, is the First World War light machine gun. It was designed here in the United States, but it was never used here. Instead, mostly British countries bought it and used it in war. It had a distinctive barrel that had a cooling shroud containing finned breech to muzzle aluminum heat sinks to cool the gun barrel, and a top mounted pan magazine. Firing any machine gun, it tends to get hot, and when it gets hot, it warps. And once it warps, well, you're not going to hit anything that you're trying to hit. The Lewis gun served until the end of the Korean War and was widely used in aircraft machine gun. It almost always had the cooling shroud removed because as the plane flew, the passage of air over the barrel helped keep it cool. But when you see a Lewis gun, you're going to see this thing with this ridiculously huge barrel. Well, that's the barrel shroud. On the big day, the men traveled to Campion and they found 50 emus within sight. Seeing as the birds were out of range, the local settlers tried to herd the emu into an ambush. But the birds split up into smaller groups and they ran in every direction, not making good targets for the machine gunners. While the first fusillade from the machine guns was ineffective due to it was too far away, the second round of gunfire did manage to kill a few birds, a very few birds. But at the end of the day, they had killed maybe a dozen. The next significant event was November 4th. Meredith had established an ambush near a local dam, and about 1,000 emus were spotted heading towards their position. This time the gunners waited until the birds were close and then began to open fire. Both guns jammed. They killed about 12 birds that day as well. In the days that followed, Meredith chose to move further south where the birds were reported to be a little friendlier. But there was only limited success despite this effort. By the fourth day of the campaign, Army observers noted that each pack of birds had one distinctive looking leader. It was always the biggest bird of the bunch, who would stand and watch the surrounding territory looking for predators or soldiers while all the other birds ate. So the head honcho was standing guard while all the other birds had dinner. At the slightest inkling of anything coming close, the alarm was sounded and the birds would take off in every direction. At one point, Meredith went so far as to mount the machine guns on the back of a truck, hoping to be able to chase down the birds to kill them. You ever seen an emu run? Well, that was a lost cause. The emus managed to outrun the truck, and the machine gunners in the back of the truck couldn't take any shots because they were too busy trying to hang on for dear life. By November 8th, they had fired approximately 2,500 rounds of ammunition and they had killed maybe 50 birds. Now, the Army tried to say they killed between 200 and 500, but that was probably just government math. The machine gunners' dream of this point blank firing into masses of emus was dissipating rapidly. The emu community had evidently ordered their birds to go on the offensive on occasion, and instead of running away, they attacked the soldiers. Me- Members of the Australian House of Representatives discussed the operation. Following the negative coverage of the events in the local media, which included claims that only a few birds were ever even killed, Pierce withdrew the military and the guns. From that point on, it was known as the Emu Wars, which was a complete and utter failure. People have actually made movies about what happened that day in that time back in Australia. The first movie was called, and I can't find the darn thing. It was called the Emu Wars. And then a group got together and they made another movie. Well, they were going to make another movie, but I don't think it's ever been made. Of all the people to be involved, John Cleese, as in Monty Python's Flying Circus, and I believe it was his wife and a few others, were said to be making a movie called The Great Emu Wars. Well, it was supposed to have come out last year, I believe, but so far, nothing. Which is a shame because I'd really love to have seen that. In total, they'd fired about 2,500 rounds, and they could only lay claim to maybe a dozen or so dead birds, even though they kept saying there were a lot more. Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, tell other people they should be listening too. If you didn't enjoy the show, then why are you still listening? If you have something you'd like to tell me, maybe a good story for my next book, anything involving ghosts or UFOs or cryptids or something really unexplainable that you've seen, you can contact me at strangethings@arcanessa.com. Until next time, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where there strung up a man who they say he murdered 3? Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.